All right. One long story in this video. I pulled this up yesterday and I thought, man, this is a great story. I've got to share this story. I've had it for a long time. I just am now getting to it. The title is I Met a Strange Little Man in the Woods. It's not going to sound like a Bigfoot story right out of the gate, but just hang on because it's really good. He writes, Cam, please don't use my name. You'll find out why later in this story. In 1969, I was 12 years old. My parents owned a river cabin on a very remote section of the Natchez River in what is called the Big Thicket. The Big Thicket is a name given to a region of heavily forested area of southeast Texas. We spent our summers away from my hometown in Beaumont, Texas on that very beautiful but rustic river. In the spring of 1969, my best friend Tim and I decided to save our money and purchase a 2-man GI surplus rubber raft. We had great dreams and discussions of how we would fish all day from our own raft. We worked all spring and summer, mowing yards and collecting bottles to earn money. And finally, in midsummer, we had saved the $31 for the raft. We asked Tim's father to take us downtown to the GI surplus to finally buy our raft. Let me say that the raft lived up to our expectations. We rode that thing all over the river, fishing and swimming from our own personal 2-man survival raft. We had tons of fun and the feeling of accomplishment was the absolute best. It was a great summer. The raft represented our freedom and our own ability to provide something special for ourselves. One day toward the end of summer and before school started, we were staying up at the cabin, but Tim wasn't with us. I decided to go up early and I got out fishing in the raft. My dad always insisted that we row upriver so that no matter what, the current would bring us home. My dad was a wise man and a great outdoorsman. I was always smart to follow his advice. I stuck near the shore when rowing because the current wasn't as strong near the sandbars. While rowing upriver that morning, I passed a sandbar that I was familiar with. We had fished from it and swam off of it. We called it our secret sandbar. I don't know why, but back then everything had to have a name. And it was a great place to seine for minnows for bait, but on that warm summer morning, I noticed something different. There was a long, thick black rubber hose that was partially covered and coming out of the woods behind the sandbar, and it trailed down into the river. That was odd, I thought. I've never seen that before. Being 12 years old and very curious and too young to be alarmed, I rowed to shore and pulled the raft up on the sandbar and decided to investigate the origin of the mysterious hose. Perhaps I should have gone back to the cabin and gotten my dad or my older brother, but I was too eager to know where the hose was coming from. Walking alone in the woods didn't concern me at all because I did it every day when I was at the cabin, so off I went into the thicket to investigate. I walked 50 yards into the woods and the whole time carefully following the hose. I noticed that the hose was jumping a little like it was pumping water from the river. This was just getting more and more interesting. I came upon a metal box that the hose was connected to, and then it split into 2 hoses that V'd off in 2 directions but not far apart. I followed the hose further until I heard a noise up ahead in the woods like someone hammering on a pipe. I kept following the hose until I saw something in the distance and it didn't fit. And I crept a little closer and I was stunned when I saw sitting there in the woods an object that looked like a small submarine. Well, I stopped and stared and went into Indian Daniel Boone squirrel hunter mode. And I quietly snuck up a little further and saw a little man wearing a jumpsuit and a hard hat working on some type of equipment out in front of the submarine thing. I could now see that it was larger than I first realized. What was I looking at? I was a naive kid, so I yelled, "Hey!" The little man looked up at me and stared and then looked behind him and said something to someone that I could not see. And then he said in a strange accent, "Are you alone, boy?" "Yes, sir. I'm following this black hose to see where it goes." It leads right here, he said. I'm using the hose to pump water to cool some equipment I'm working on. How did you get here? I told him that I rode to the sandbar in my rubber raft, and then things got interesting. What happened next I'll never forget as long as I live. The little man, who was shorter than me, stopped working and came over to me, and he reached out and patted my shoulder and said, "What's your name, boy?" I told him my name and asked him his. I don't remember his name, but it wasn't one of the usual names I had heard before. I asked him what the little submarine was doing in the woods, and he turned and looked at it and laughed. "Boy, this isn't a submarine. Have you ever seen a submarine in the woods before?" he asked. It was silvery gray, like a submarine, and tubular shaped with a porthole and a hatch door opened on the side. It was 30 to 40 feet long at my best guess. "What is it?" I asked. "It's a re-entry vehicle," he said. "A what?" "It's a flying ship for space travel," he said. "You mean like Apollo?" I asked. "Kind of like that," he said, "but it doesn't have rockets like your Apollo craft." And then I realized the little man was pulling my leg. "What is a spaceship doing out here in the woods on the Natchez River?" I asked, smiling. "I'm a transfer agent, and I'm in the process of transferring my resource into a salt cave far under the surface of this forest." Well, I had no idea what he was talking about. And then the little fellow told me that he was hungry, and he asked if I'd like to eat with him. I hadn't had breakfast, so I asked, "Well, what do you have?" He offered some fruit and some dark bread. The fruit was kind of like grapes, but yellow, and the bread was thick and very tasty. He said he liked our butter, but he didn't have any. "What do you mean, our butter?" I asked. We sat down to breakfast, and he started to tell me a far-out story. By the way, the yellow grapes were the best fruit I have ever eaten in my life. He said to me, "You look like a smart boy, and what I'm about to tell you, you have to keep a secret. If you tell it, no one's going to believe you anyway." I should have listened to him and kept my mouth shut, but more about that later. And this is what he told me. "I am one of 1,600 transfer agents stationed on this beautiful blue planet. I am assigned to the petroleum division, and my job is to transfer crude petroleum into various places into underground caves in Texas and Louisiana. There are 113 of us petroleum agents assigned to this planet. The other agents are not in my division. They transfer other resources such as water, salt, plants, animals, precious metals, chemicals, and other needed resources to and from this world of yours. We transfer the resources mostly from the other planets in our solar system. The plants and animals come from places far away." And he went on to say that our water originally came from the red planet, and now it comes from the rings of Saturn. Our salt comes from Mercury, and our petroleum and sulfur come from Venus. Most of our metals come from Uranus and Pluto, and some transfer agents continually test our oceans for the correct salinity balance, and when needed, salt is transferred from Mercury. He said that when water is corrupted, it is removed and replaced with fresh water, and that this process goes on continually, but more recently since there had been a fast rise in our population. "It's our job," he said, "to make sure the blue planet never runs out of what is needed for mankind." I asked if the oil is brought in his spacecraft. "Good question," he said. "The best way to explain it is like this. We transfer on and off planet through another dimension. The resource is changed into a non-physical quintessence and then transferred to where it is assigned and then changed back into its physical form. If we couldn't do it that way, we couldn't do it at all." "Well, who do you work for?" I asked. "Do you work for Mobil or Texaco?" "Oh, you're a smart boy," he said. "I cannot tell you who I work for, but if you think very hard, you will figure it out." "Well, why can't you just tell me?" I asked. "That's the one bit of information that I can't share with you," he said. "Well, do you work for God?" I asked. He only stared at me and said, "All I can say is that he comes from a physical realm and that the transfer agents are assigned by very wise and affectionate authorities." I asked him how much he gets paid to do his job. He laughed out loud in his funny little voice and he said, "I'm getting paid right now by getting to visit with you." Well, I wasn't sure what he meant, but it made me feel good. The little man turned and said something in a different language behind him and toward the vessel. So I looked behind him and I saw something that I had not seen before. There, in front of the craft, stood a large, hairy, man-type animal. I have since figured out that it was a Bigfoot. At the time, I thought it was an ape, but it didn't stoop over like an ape, and it had a face with a nose, and it had human-like eyes. But this thing was huge. It was tall as the craft and looked at me in a way that scared me. Immediately, I jumped up and I said, "What is that thing?" The little man said, "This is a friend of mine. He's a forest guardian who makes sure no one comes around here to tamper with the transfer equipment." He then took me behind the craft and he showed me a Christmas tree, or that's what we call them in Texas. A Christmas tree in Texas is a stack of wellhead valves and adapters. It was like none I had ever seen, and I had seen many in my life, even at 12. Wellhead adapters were everywhere in southeast Texas. "This is where I transfer the resource into the ground and down to the salt caves below," he said. "Well, what does that big hairy fellow do?" I asked. The little man told me that he is here to guard this and other equipment so no one bothers it. He said there are many of them all over the country and all over the planet, that they are our friends who protect the transfer agent's equipment when we're not here. He went on to say that they are good at frightening people away who get too close to what they protect. They won't harm you, he said, unless you get too close to what they guard. These things are not from this planet, but they like it on the blue planet because they are left alone and there's plenty of food to eat. He also told me that they can cause a person to become very scared just by looking at them. The little guy then took me back to where we were eating, and he told me he had something for me. He went into his ship and brought out a box. He opened it, and inside was a small device the shape of what I can only describe as a small Mercury space capsule. He took it out and placed it in my hand. It was small, and it was made of metal like stainless steel. "What is it?" I asked. He told me that he wanted me to keep it, and as long as I had it with me, I would never be bothered by the forest guardian or by any one of the other more unfriendly visitors. "Well, who are the unfriendly visitors?" I asked. "There are creatures that visit this planet for much different reasons than the transfer agents," he said. "They're cruel and nasty little brutes who are up to no good. If you hang on to this little gift, they will never bother you." He then asked me to tell him about my family and friends and where I went to school and if I went to church. I chatted on about all the things that I was interested in: fishing, baseball, comic books, model airplanes, and hunting squirrels. I told him about how my friend Tim and I had saved up and bought the raft, and I told him about being a Boy Scout and an altar boy in the Catholic Church and that I attended Catholic school. He seemed to like hearing this, and he told me to always be especially good to my mother and my sister. I told him I had a gift for him, and I pulled a folded comic book from my back pocket. It was a Marvel comic of the Fantastic Four, and he smiled and thanked me and said that he would enjoy it. And then an alarm sounded, and the little man put on his hard hat, wrapped up his leftovers, and said he had to get back to work. He patted my shoulder again and said he enjoyed talking with me. He made me promise that I would not tell anyone about our conversation and to never let anyone see the small device that he had given me. I promised him I would keep our secrets, and I said goodbye. I waved at his big hairy friend, and then off I went back to my beached raft. I knew I would never forget the weirdest day of my whole life. The next school year, I was in the 7th grade and changed from a private Catholic school to public junior high. All my old friends were there too. My friend Tim would come a year later because he was a year younger than me. School was going great, but a problem started when we were assigned an English class to write a paper on what we did over the summer. I wrote about Tim and me buying the raft, and I stupidly wrote about meeting the little man in the woods. Yep, I wrote everything, including the part about the resources from the other planets and the big hairy man. I told about the submarine that turned out to be a spaceship and the food and all of it. I even told about the device the little man gave to me and that it would protect me. It was an 11-page report. I turned it in to Mrs. Beale and expected an A on my first assignment in junior high. Man, was I surprised 2 days later when I was called to the principal's office. I didn't even know who the principal was because I was a brand new student. Well, I went to the office during math class and I waited on the bench outside. And I was called in and was greeted by not only the principal, but also a man in uniform who was introduced to me as the local sheriff. I started to get scared because me and some buddies had recently been throwing rocks at hobos who were riding in open train cars over the tracks. I was sure the sheriff was there to arrest me for stoning hobos. That's not what they were concerned about, though. Mr. Newberry, my principal, opened his desk and pulled out my assignment from English class. I immediately began getting nervous and scared. Mr. Newberry asked, "Did you write these papers?" Thinking back, I should have said no. I should have said my brother wrote it, or I read the story in a comic book, or anything other than what I said. But being a good Catholic boy, I couldn't lie. "Yes, I wrote it. What's wrong with it?" I said. Mr. Newberry chimed in. "Daryl, you were supposed to write what you did over the summer, not a fantastic story about spaceships and big hairy monsters in the woods. Did you really buy a rubber raft?" "Yes, sir," I replied. "It's in my garage right now, but it's deflated." "Who is your friend Tim?" asked the sheriff. Well, I told all about Tim and that he was still in the 6th grade at St. Anthony's. The sheriff then asked if my parents had a cabin on the Natchez River. "Yes, sir," I said. And right then, I should have asked to have my parents called in, but back then I was too stupid to know better. And then the sheriff asked me if I really did meet a little man in the woods. And this is where I finally snapped. "No," I said, "I made the whole thing up." And then the sheriff asked, "Have you ever seen a big hairy ape man in the woods on the Natchez River?" "No, sir, I made that up too," I said. "Why did you make this story up, young man?" said Mr. Newberry. I thought fast. I don't know, I guess I had a boring summer and I wanted to write something interesting. And then the sheriff said, "Son, it's okay to tell us if you really did meet this little man. If you did, I'd like to thank you for writing the story and would like to see the device he gave you. Maybe you would be willing to sell it to me for $20. $20? Dang, I thought. $20. And then reason trumped my excitement. "No, sir," I said, "I made the whole thing up." The principal and the sheriff looked at each other, and then Mr. Newberry said, "In the future, son, you should stick to the truth and not make up science fiction stories like this ever again." Then he told me that it had upset Mrs. Beale, and I promised I would stick to the truth, and then I was dismissed. I have a cousin who at the time was a captain in the Army. He flew helicopters in Vietnam. I'd even written a story about him in 6th grade as the person who was my greatest hero. I guess I shouldn't have written that story either. But out of the blue, and some weeks after my visit to the school principal, my cousin called and said that he was going to be in town that next Sunday. He asked if I'd like for him to take me to the Dairy Queen. Dairy Queen? Heck yeah! The next weekend, my cousin arrived at our house and visited with my parents, and then we drove to Dairy Queen. When we arrived at the DQ, there was an Air Force officer sitting at a booth in the back. We ordered sundaes, and then my cousin walked over to the Air Force guy and spoke to him. He then invited me to join them. Cool, I thought, an Air Force guy and an Army guy. This is awesome. When I joined them, I was introduced to the Air Force man who was a captain. And I asked what he flew, and he told me that he wasn't a pilot and that he was in Air Force intelligence. So you're a spy? I asked. He laughed and said, no, I only study reports. After visiting for a few minutes, the unexpected happened. The Air Force officer pulled out a briefcase, and he opened it and pulled out a copy of my English assignment. There it was again, my English assignment about what I did last summer. I became confused and scared. Daryl, you've written quite a story here. Can we talk about it? He asked. The conversation was quite different from the one I had with my principal and the sheriff. The Air Force guy told me that I was not the first person to have this type of experience, and that he believed that I really did meet the little man in the woods. He said they know there are big hairy ape men in the big thicket, and that he would like to know all that I could tell him. He asked me if I entered the spacecraft. Well, I made the mistake and said no, instead of saying I made it all up. He asked me if I still had the device, and I finally snapped and said no, that I made it all up, and he kept at it as if I was being interrogated. He said that it was my duty as an American and a Catholic Boy Scout to tell the truth and to let him see the device. Well, I'm not proud of what I did next. I was a tough kid, but I'd had enough, and I started crying. I mean, really sobbing. I guess I was just too stressed out to take any more. I felt betrayed by my cousin and by my English teacher and my principal. I wished I would have just kept quiet about the whole thing. I wanted to call my dad. Heck, I was only 12 years old and I was scared. I didn't like lying. I was in the depths of despair. I had never felt this stupid and upset with myself in my whole life. Why couldn't I have just written something else, I thought. And then something awesome happened. My cousin put his arm around me and pulled me close to him. And then he looked at the Air Force guy and he said, "That's enough. You're scaring the hell out of my little cousin. This meeting is over." The Air Force captain didn't respond. He got up and he walked out. I was sad for two reasons. First, for having to answer yet again to some unknown person in uniform about my English assignment, and two, I didn't get to eat my ice cream sundae. My cousin is still alive. He is a retired Army colonel. He is still my hero and has never asked again about my story. I've never said another word about it. And today, I'm in my 60s and I'm no longer afraid. I have not had another encounter with a Bigfoot or the strange little man in the woods. I still have the little device. I guess it's kept me safe. I'll never know for sure. Even now, I have a copy of my original English assignment. That's another story. And yes, I've completely figured out who the little man and all the other transfer agents work for. This long ago experience has shaped my life and my beliefs. I don't worry about things other folks fret over. I know that we will not be left to starve or run out of clean water or any other wonderful necessities that we enjoy on this beautiful planet we call home. I know that we are loved and provided for, and yes, even protected. I also know that all those Bigfoots you are always talking about are here for a good reason. And one more thing. Over the years, I have remembered other things the strange little man in the woods told me. Do not be afraid to believe in what your parents taught you about someone up above. Also, the strange little man taught me roughly 10 or so things that would ensure my success in life. They sounded silly at the time, but I started taking those things seriously 25 years ago. They've worked out extremely well. Please do not share my contact information. I said I'm not scared anymore, but the last thing I want is to be visited again. Thanks for giving us folks who have had unusual experiences a voice. Cam, I love your stories. And some even sound true. What about yours, dude? What about yours? He writes, I love you, man. I'm one of your people. Well, I'm one of your people too, sir. And I don't know. I did a story yesterday called Bigfoot and the Monster in Me. It's actually an email I got. And I got this one. I'm just kind of going through a phase where I'm drawn to these really strange stories. And a lot of people think I should kind of brush those aside. Now, I will say, I do get some that are so outlandish that I know that the writer's trolling me. There's no doubt in my mind, and I'll trash those. But you can tell by what I just read, I don't just throw away, stories that just seem outrageous. This man is quite believable. I cannot attest to the truth or non-truth of this story, but he spent a heck of a lot of time writing this thing, and it's a great story, and I actually believe him. I don't know. Now, that doesn't mean I necessarily believe that the Bigfoots are space creatures that are put here to protect wellheads and things like that. I don't know. I don't even want to try to figure all that out. It's just such a deep subject. I kind of like keeping all of these theories kind of bouncing around in my head. I watched Carrie's 168 Hours last night and this morning, and he's making the case that the Bigfoot, you cannot get a good image of them. It's just impossible to get a good image. I don't know about that, but that's a theory that I like bouncing around in my head. That's a different idea that I've actually never heard before. I always thought people were just taking pictures and finding dark objects behind green foliage and just kind of, you can do that with clouds. You can look up at a cloud and you can make it look like anything. You can make it look like a dinosaur or a dog face or a razorback. I've done that all my life. And you can do the same thing in the woods through a blurry picture. Anyway, but I enjoy the possibility of all these theories. They're fantastic. This particular story is the theory that Bigfoot are alien and that there are actually entities from other solar systems in the universe visiting our planet and supplying our planet with the resources that we need to survive and even thrive. So it was fascinating to me. The guy's a good writer, and there's your story. Hope you guys enjoyed it, and we'll see you on the next one. Thanks.